Augie, today is a special episode. A Zeiss Lenses Gladiator Theme Edition. Shouldn't I wear a toga then? I'm not buying a toga at Supervillains Bezos' website so he can go to space again to build his moon laser. All just so you can look like a university member at a fraternity for virgins named Phi Beta Male. I'm not a virgin. What does a boob feel like? Like melons? Is that a question? No? Augie, this is the reason why you're shunned by other virgins. Your cautionary tale for what happens when nerds are not smart enough to pay for a rental girlfriend. Those ladies told me I have the wrong equipment. Yes, unlike those Zeiss lenses today that are the right equipment. No loser elements in those. Glass pun intended. Zeiss lenses. Incredibly high quality glass that outperforms 98% of all other lens brands. They can also even strongly compete with Leica, since Zeiss image quality has that 3D pop that many of us are after. Also, unlike Leica, Zeiss is not delusionally priced. It doesn't come with that whiff of corrupt privilege and sex tourism. The focal length we will cover today is 35mm, 3 generations of manual Zeiss glass, all 3 made out of metal. For affiliate links, see below, up your butthole. I bought these lenses on eBay, the way lenses are meant to be bought, used or new at severe discount. It's what heroes do. First up, the classic Distagon 35mm f2. The optical formula is almost identical to the Zeiss Cinema lenses CP2 and CP3. In other words, the Zeiss Cinema lenses are classics in a rehoused body to accommodate the cinema gear. Its smaller size makes it practical for gimbal use. And look at that image quality. Excellent three-dimensionality. Objects look how they're supposed to look. It's one of the more sharper Zeiss classics at f2 with great contrast. Image quality is clean, as a germaphobe cell phone or a nice guy's empty online dating inbox. While not a macro lens, it can come very close to objects. Next up, the classic Distagon 35mm f1.4. Larger and heavier than its f2 counterpart, it is capable of letting in more light. This classic is also known by many to have the nicest 35mm rendering of any 35mm focal lens. Other than the rendering, its bokeh is as smooth as James Bond's zipper. The bokeh is even smoother at f2 than the Distagon F2 version at f2. Its center sharpness at f1.4 is actually quite good in real-life application, and it also has semi-macro capability. Last but not least, the Milvus 35mm f1.4. Unlike the Milvus 35mm f2, which is just a weather-sealed version of the classic f2, the Milvus 3514 has all the new engineering. It supposedly has no chromatic aberration, is sharper, and has more contrast. So far, its image quality is superb. It also seems to have even more of a Zeiss 3D pop than the earlier generations. Its subject separation is almost on the scale of a longer focal length. The Milvus as well displays its semi-macro capability. But is it a lens that cheap bastards would want to invest compared to its already high-quality predecessors? Well, we will see. Let's start with the focus mechanism. The focus ring on the Distagon F2 is very well engineered. Everything fits tight, like Robocop's prostate. A smooth turn like this won't be found on lenses with autofocus, where it's all fly-by-wire. The analog-style manual focus on this Distagon gives you the control and right resistance to dial in that focus. While twisting and turning, it actually affects the length of the barrel, a phrase that UPS guys muttered about my ex-wife. As for the Distagon F1.4, the construction feels even more heavy and broad-shouldered, a statement that the FedEx guys muttered about my ex-wife. Interestingly, while it's smooth, there's twice the resistance on the focus wheel. Depending on your preference, that might be a good or a bad thing. One thing people will like is that it has a longer focus turn, which will make the focusing even more accurate than the Distagon F2. Now we get to the Milvus F1.4. The weather sealing gives it a different feel. It's dense but also sleek. It has the same focus turning distance as the Distagon F1.4 approximately, but is smoother with less resistance than even the Distagon F2. The barrel does not extend when turning, so it will not create any problems if you're using a matte box. The center of the barrel has a rubber layer, which can get tiny temporary scratches. Something to keep in mind when handling the rubber. Something I wish the ex-wife would have done, instead of trying to pin the Pure Laters guy kid on me. It should be mentioned the two Distagons are Canon EF mount, using electronic aperture control through the camera body. The Milvus is a Nikon F mount, which has a manual aperturing. However, the focus turns into the opposite direction. Before I delve into the extensive ultimate video comparison, I will quickly get the photography part out of the way first, for reasons I will explain later. The pics were done by the G9 in natural mode, at 400 ISO with the Metabones Speed Booster XL. In pictures at f1.4 and f2 there's only a slight difference in bokeh and sharpness. At f2.8 they become hard to distinguish at all if lighting is identical. The Milvus is a 14-element lens. The Distagon F1.4 has 11 elements, and the Distagon F2 has 9 elements. It appears the more elements there are, it pushes the image rendering slightly closer. What about real-world chromatic aberrations? Surprisingly, I didn't see much on the Distagons. There was plenty of light creating harsh contrasts. Apparently, if you don't take pics of black and white charts and brick walls, it's not that big of an issue with corner distortions and aberrations. Who knew reality doesn't necessarily reflect charts? Flaring? Not a huge difference either, but the Milvus has slightly less. What about bokeh? At f1.4 the Distagon seems to be slightly smoother than the Milvus, and that's consistently regardless of angles. At f2 both the Milvus and f1.4 are smoother than the f2. However, once we reach f2.8 then all three lenses have the bokeh smoothness that becomes almost indistinguishable. And at f4 it's the same story. That concludes the pictures. For video there's a neglected variable, and it's the ND filter. ND filters will change the optical character of the lens, depending on the amount of elements being used in the lens. It's quite exciting. As exciting as poking a hole in the ground and skittles flowing out. There was a metaphor, Augie. You lopside-headed base Shrek. You could have hit the lenses. No worries, I have a good aim. I never sprinkled on a toilet seat. Well, that's because your knob can't reach the bowl with its size. It looks like a zit that got popped, releasing Mountain Dew mist into the atmosphere. The fruit flies around you must have post-traumatic stress. Once you add the ND filters, it drastically changes the way shadows and light fall on the scenery. It becomes especially obvious in the outdoors in exposed sunlight. All filters are KNF. In the Milvus and Distagon f1.4 share the same 72mm filter. What about lens breathing? The actual breathing amount between them seems to be the same. If you're fine with that amount of breathing, it's up to you. It's definitely nowhere as extreme as old cinema anamorphic lenses, but you can see the edges shifting compared to the very expensive cinema lenses. The composition does make an optical difference if you have more dimensions to distract from the edges of the frames. However, lens breathing is one of those strange elitist criteria. And in all honesty, 90% of all intelligent viewers care about lens breathing as much as Hollywood cares about putting perverts behind jail. In other words, not at all. What about contrast wide open? The Milvus has fuller colors with its contrast. By the way, all video footage is filmed with the GH5s in V-Log at 400 ISO using a Metabones XL adapter. Focal equivalence is 40mm. The Distagon f1.4 has slightly smoother bokeh, but the contrast of the Milvus makes the object separation pop more. There will be people that will actually prefer the less contrasty look of the Distagon f1.4, since it has that more classic character look. The difference in contrast remained in 2f2. How they render 3D space is almost identical. However, once they are at f2.8, they all look the same depending on the lighting. This is now a decision cheap bastards would have to make. Used on eBay, the Distagon f1.4 is twice the price of the Distagon f2, and the Milvus is twice the price of the Distagon f1.4. And if you mainly shoot f2.8 to f5, which is standard for most productions, why spend the extra money for 2 additional stops of light if you could buy 3 more additional Distagon f2 lenses in different focal length? And let's say your decision is between the 2 f1.4 lenses. Do you want to spend twice as much just for more contrast? Which could be compensated most of the times in editing with the contrast slider. Same with the sharpness. It's something you could fix via slider with that subtle of a difference. However, sometimes you don't get that organic contrast via editing. Are you gonna chance it? Same with risking having a digital sharpness look. Having said that, if you prefer the vintage look, but are sick and tired of the fuzzy communist lenses that can haze up any second with a chromatic aberration, then the Distagon f1.4 might be your perfect 35mm. It should also be mentioned that light being a harsh mistress can make the Distagon look as contrasty as the Milvus depending on your composition. How are the flares with the ND filter on? Well, it's quite well controlled. Then again, they all have the Zeiss T coatings, and while the Milvus coating is newer, there's very little real-world difference in flares. What if you remove the ND filters? Same story. The flare patterns look the same, and quite frankly would give a very cool artistic effect. But none of those tests matter unless we use a human subject, or a distorted approximation. Our model today is Augie, also known as Maximus Aglimus Minimus Schlongimus. Interesting side fact, Augie has been legally declared an oxygen thief in 15 European countries. I have a question. Yes, oxygen thief? I would want to. You are in your usual spectacular form, I see. Augie, this is the reason why I would unplug your life support in order to charge my phone. And then I would sue the doctors for not strangling you earlier with the cord. But enough talk about my daydreams. Let the Zeiss 35mm face-off commence. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the optical battle of the lenses. Watch it, Augie, you misshapen oaf. Don't look at your reflection. Augie, you have the look of a pirate who just had a heat stroke. Let's show some very wide lenses, where wide open is the best option. For the ones wondering how close you can get to an actor's face, here you go. The Milvus actually is able to get closest, surprisingly. Those gallons of pepper spray those beady eyes must have encountered. And now, very importantly, the medium shot. The bread and butter distance of a dramatic scene. Milvus renders the skin tones well. Full color and contrast help with the 3D pop. The Distagon F1.4 matches with the nice rendering. The more vintage character of this lens has a certain charm that would be more obvious if Augie wouldn't be in the frame. As for the Distagon F2, wide open, the essentials are all there. You can perfectly shoot a project without getting concerned about image quality. The Zeiss character is strong in all three lenses. That draws this lens battle to a finish. So what is the conclusion? If you shoot most of your projects in f2.8 to f5.6, then the Distagon 35mm f2 is the best option, and all you really need in a 35mm. The image quality has a clean and organic look that rivals the optical quality of any decent cinema lens. You can't really ask for anything more. But let's say you do ask for more, like more light in bokeh. Then the Distagon 35mm f1.4 would be your option. If other than light, you would be satisfied with the f2 version. And as a bonus, you get slightly better rendering of human faces and more control in manual focus. And now the Milvus 35mm f1.4. Let's say you use the 35mm focal length a lot, and you understand you will be using this lens for years to come over several generations of camera bodies. And this is the only reasonable long-term option. The Milvus optical quality can complement even the Otus line. So if you are able to, why wouldn't you buy the best 35mm lens available for the budget filmmaker? Augie, any damage that occurs here will be taken from your paycheck. You don't pay me anything. And I would feel like a fool if I would. If this would be the original Colosseum, they would have advertised you to the masses as the human version of period cramps, looking like Caligula's fluffer. And unlike burly gladiators back in the day, you would have to crawl up a chicken's butt in order to get laid.